What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Michael and welcome to FudgeMuppet. As many of you would know, Fallout New Vegas is my favorite Fallout game, and recently I've actually been playing a bit in my spare time. I started making an energy weapons build, which is something I hardly ever do, and when I hit level 16, I suddenly got access to the infamous Meltdown perk. But I wasn't really sure if I needed it or if it would be best for the build I was making. This led me to do some research on the perk, some testing of it, and to ultimately work out in detail all the pros and cons around it. I actually learned a bunch of new information on how the perk functions, and in this video I'd love to share my insight with those of you who love Fallout New Vegas and perhaps want to do a playthrough that utilizes this extremely fun perk. Also, let me know if you want more videos like this in the future, as I can talk about New Vegas forever, and thank you so much for watching our channel and enjoying all the videos we love to make. We tend to say all of our thanks in the outro, but for those of you who don't stick around through the conclusion to hear it, let me say we appreciate your support very, very much. So what does the Meltdown perk even do? Well, when you reduce the health of a target to 0 by killing them with an energy weapon, an explosion will be triggered around said target, like a kind of small version of a plasma grenade blast. This explosion damages other enemies around the target, potentially killing them too, and causing a chain reaction of further explosions, potentially damaging even more enemies after that in the process. We call this chain reaction the Meltdown. You'll need to be level 16 and have an energy weapon skill of 90 to access it, but is the Meltdown perk worth it? Well, let me tell you. Meltdown can be a seriously useful perk for the right characters, but it's not for everyone. Obviously, it goes without saying that this perk is not worth it if you don't use energy weapons, but what if you don't use laser weapons or plasma weapons? Well, here's something you might not know. While the loading screen tells you that the Meltdown perk affects plasma and laser weaponry, it actually affects all weapons affected by the energy weapons skill. This means that even if you're using a weapon like a flamer, covering your enemies in fire and burning them all to the ground, this perk will actually still take effect. So that's the first thing to consider. Perhaps you could use this perk even though you didn't think you could, due to a lack of plasma or laser weapons. Another thing to note is that the explosion will still emit a green plasma-looking blast when it procs, regardless of your weapon type. Obviously, if you're using a laser weapon, it can look out of place. So if this is something small that you'd really care about, then perhaps give the perk a miss. But if you couldn't care less and you just want to shoot fire, laser beams, plasma blasts, and see things explode as a result, then all the power to you. Now let's get into the meatier stuff. So while I said that this perk can work with any energy weapon, there's a good reason why you might still not want it. This is because a big factor at play here is how much damage the weapon you're using actually does. This is the first thing that surprised me about the perk. You see, the damage of the explosions caused by killing targets with your energy weapons is actually dictated by the damage of the weapon being used. This is a huge deal and potentially the biggest consideration when it comes to choosing this perk. So because the damage is relative, you'll get more bang for your buck if you're using a higher damage weapon. So basically this means that while you could use a standard flamer, because it's an energy weapon, the meltdown damage caused by it will still be measly, say around 10 to 20 damage. It's also close range, meaning you're at more risk of taking damage from your own meltdown explosions. Using a weapon like a Gauss rifle, on the other hand, which is long range and higher damage, proves much more effective. You'll usually far away enough that you won't get hit by your own blast, and your weapon deals extremely high damage, meaning the meltdown explosion it creates can do hundreds of points of damage, which is obviously a lot better than damage caused by a flamer explosion. Furthermore, meltdown only triggers if the initial hit of an energy weapon kills your enemy, so if you kill an enemy with a damage over time effect, like that occurring after the impact of a hollow rifle blast, nothing will happen. On another specific note, the bonus damage of a pulse gun also does not trigger this meltdown effect. Now obviously you can still use a hollow rifle or some powerful fire-based weapon that's not a standard flamer, but my points here are this. 1. The damage dealt by meltdown is relative to the damage dealt by the weapon that killed the target. Therefore, consider if you're using an energy weapon that does high enough damage per hit to make the additional explosions worth it. Generally speaking, it's worth it so long as the weapon doesn't deal low damage. 2. Consider if the weapon you're using requires you to be at close range or lets you stay back at a safe enough distance. And 3. Consider if a large majority of your kills will be due to damage over time effects, making this perk less useful. The next thing I need to mention with this perk is that it seems to just treat enemies hit by the explosion like they were struck by the main weapon which caused it. So obviously we see this when it comes to the fact that a higher damage weapon causes a higher damage explosion, but it's confirmed even more by the fact that it can even ignite other enemies if the weapon causes that, and it also carries over critical kill effects. For example, when you get a critical hit and you kill an enemy with plasma, they turn to goo, and with a laser weapon, your enemy turns to ash. Well, with Meltdown, enemies killed by explosions that happened on an energy weapon's critical hit can also be turned to goo and ash. Another example of this can be seen with the Compliance Regulator. This energy pistol causes paralysis on a critical hit, and if you happen to score one on an enemy and kill them close up, the paralysis effect can even spread to you. The mechanic as a whole is quite strange and doesn't really matter as much as the 3 main points I said before, but it's something to remember either way. Another weapon you might not have thought of is Euclid C Finder. This is actually affected by Meltdown, which means the Archimedes 2 orbital laser strike it unleashes can really result in some massive explosions. Another important thing to remember is that the damage can not only just hurt you if you're too close, but it can also hurt any companions you might be traveling with. Personally, I didn't have any problems with this, but if you're using a melee-based companion, then you might. So far, I've covered just about everything I think you need to know. The only other thing to say would be that any weapons that fire bursts in VATS mode can cause multiple explosions if your enemy dies before the final shot in a burst. Each additional hit afterwards equals one more explosion. Finally, you have to consider looting. Meltdown is one crazy perk, and it's a lot of fun, and I really like it, but it has a bad habit of sending bodies flying through the air, often into many pieces. Because you often dismember limbs, you'll also be extra effective against ghost people in the Dead Money DLC. But, as I was saying, bodies and body parts fly everywhere, and in some places in the game, this can make looting more difficult, as corpses don't simply fall neatly on the ground for you to take from. So in a nutshell, is the Meltdown perk worth it? Well, if you use a build that fights quite close up, then you'll probably get damaged by the blast, and this won't be worth it. If you always have a melee companion who also gets damaged by the blast, you can still use it and not care, but you might find it less worth it. If you use a low damage weapon or a kind of weak damage over time based weapon as the main weapon for your build, this is not worth it. Apart from that, this perk is probably worth it for just about every other energy weapons based build. If you use energy weapons that can keep you far outside of the explosive blast, which is most of them, then this is worth it. If you use a very high damage energy weapon that fits this criteria, then it is even more worth it. If you often find fighting hordes of enemies difficult, then this is extra worth it because you can just use a slower fire weapon like a Gauss rifle to shoot one enemy in the middle and take out the other two on either side. If you don't mind that the explosion effect, looking plasma, might not fit the aesthetic of the gun you're using, then you have yet another reason to use this perk. So all in all, it's a pretty effective perk. The main drawbacks being it can damage you and your allies if you're not careful, and it's not so effective if you're using a weak weapon. One personal FudgeMuppet tip I have for you is that this perk can be great if you're using more than one combat method. For example, if you shoot enemies from far away and benefit massively from Meltdown, you could then switch to a melee weapon when they get up close, meaning that you won't have to worry about getting hit by your own explosions. Whereas if you only have energy weapons as your sole offensive skill, then you might find yourself in a bad spot if you can't kill an enemy before they reach you. Even if you used energy weapons and standard guns, you'd be sweet, or energy weapons and unarmed. The choice is yours if you want that extra way of staying safe and killing people while having variety in your playthrough at the same time. And that is all, ladies and gentlemen, everything you need to know about the Meltdown perk in Fallout New Vegas and whether or not it's worth using for your playthrough. The good rule of thumb is that if you're playing a high damage energy weapons build, get this perk. If you're really not sure, you could just try saving the game before choosing the perk and then giving it a good test run to see if you like it. If you don't like it, just load back, but I think you'll like it. Social media links are in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. As always, my name is Michael, and I look forward to nerding out with you again very soon.